Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
And that's another lesson I think that we can all take away, which is that sometimes we think, oh, we don't have time to go for that 15-minute break, outside, or we don't have time to go for a 30-minute walk on a tree-lined street. But actually, if we do that, it does actually make us more focused and happier for the rest of the people in our lives. We become more pleasant people and more productive people if we do allow ourselves to take that break outside.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 38, where we're already in June. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Florence Williams about her book, The Nature Fix: Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. Florence Williams is a journalist, best-selling author, podcaster, and public speaker. She is a contributing editor at Outside Magazine and a freelance writer for the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, the New York Review of Books, Slate, Mother Jones, and numerous other publications. She is also the writer and host of the new Audible original series, Breasts Unbound, as well as Outside Magazine's Double X Factor podcast. Her public speaking includes keynotes at Google, the Smithsonian, the Seattle Zoo, the Aspen Ideas Festival, and many other corporate, academic, and nonprofit venues. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster. I'm here today with the author of The Nature Fix. Let me, here we go. I just like to remind myself that the books are still there. They still exist in physical form. So I'm going to read The Nature Fix: Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative by Florence Williams. Florence, hello. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, John. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And I'm so glad to discuss your book because I'm a huge nature fan. I live in Brooklyn and I live within walking distance of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And I'm a member and I love to just wander over there and explore. And so I've always felt this connection, and it's so interesting to find out at a much deeper level what science is starting to tell us about why that connection works and is there and is strong. But so I'll let you talk for a minute because I really like to start off with kind of in your mind a summary of the book, and we'll go from there.
Sure, thanks. Well, the book really started as a couple of magazine articles. First for Outside Magazine, which sent me to Japan. And that was the first place I went to write about this practice called forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku. And, researchers were studying kind of the effects on people's nervous systems and their physiologies when they went into the woods for 15 minutes. And it happened at a really good time for me because I had just moved from the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, really to downtown Washington, D.C. And I felt this huge shift in my own psychology and physiology, in those different environments. So I was very curious about what the science had to say about how being in different settings affects us, emotionally and psychologically. And it turns out there's a lot of work being done on sort of the physical side too, and even like our immune systems. And so for me, it was just a good time, and I just really appreciated that there was a lot of new science in this area. I mean, environmental psychologists, have been talking about kind of the profound impacts that different environments have on us emotionally, but it was like a whole new level now, where there's all this new imaging technology, a lot of like kind of mobile laboratory work. And so eventually I kind of realized that there was really a book there, partly woven in, with my own experience.
Yeah. And I think that part is one of the most interesting aspects of the book to me, is you really inserted yourself into this. You sort of personally traveled all over the world, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Finland, all these countries, and you participated in research studies. So it's a bit different, I think, than other books, other science books, where there will be a discussion about what's happening, but what's happening is sort of over there. You made yourself an active part of this, and I was just curious about why you felt that was going to work.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of something I do. It's sort of my signature style as a journalist. I do what I call sort of first person science journalism, or first person science, where I do kind of use myself and my body sometimes as a proxy for some of the experiments. And of course, those are not experiments in and of themselves. I mean, I'm an N of one. But it's a way to talk about the science and to kind of humanize it. And it's a way to kind of bring in my own history and my own story. And certainly with this topic, I felt like there was kind of an urgency, personally, to my finding out, why my changing environment had such an impact on me. I mean, when I moved to Washington, it just really bummed me out. I really noticed it. I mean, I got depressed and I got anxious, and the noise pollution drove me nuts, and I had trouble sleeping. So there was this very sort of personal piece to it, where I wanted to find out if the science was real, what it had to say, and then ultimately, what the lessons were from what I learned by talking to these researchers around the world, to how to carry some of these lessons back into my own urban life. And I also felt like that had a lot of relevance for other people, because, most of us do live in cities. Most of us have lost some connection to nature. And yet, if we take the science seriously and we believe that this is really critical, for our emotional well-being, how do we regain some of it back? How do we capture it into our urban lives? And so, I think all of that really motivated me.
Yeah, and I think it really shows in the book, and that's a really interesting way of thinking about writing. So yeah, I want to ask a couple quick questions about how you wrote the book, and then we can talk about some of what you learned. Um, so to start off with, what was your writing process? So you mentioned that there were some magazine articles. How did you bring those together? What's it like for you when you're writing a book?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of magazine journalists kind of face this question of, when is this something more than a magazine article, and how do you know?
Mm-hmm.
I had already written a book, and I was fortunate in that my same publisher with whom I did my first book, was also immediately interested in this topic. And even though I wasn't sure if there was enough for a book there, both my agent and my publisher, my editor at my publishing house, which was Norton, were very encouraging. And I actually sold this book just based on sort of a 3-page email. I didn't even really write a full proposal for it. And that is, that is both good and bad.
Yeah.
So the problem was that, I got the contract and realized I didn't really know exactly what was going to be in the book. Because I hadn't done that kind of deep research that you put into a proposal. So then I had this kind of like, oh shit moment of like, what am I actually going to put in here? And then, so that's when I got the second magazine article. And that was really fortunate, because that was for National Geographic. They were doing a special issue just about the national parks and why parks are so important for people. And so I did this piece for them on your brain on nature. And the reason it was so lucky is that National Geographic, of course, famously has this huge reporting budget, in which they send their photographers and their reporters around the world. So I actually, on their dime, I probably visited 6 or 7 countries and was able to get all this research done for the article, but also for the book. So it really funded all my research, which was kind of, just the stroke of pure luck, I think, really.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. It's kind of a great 2-for-1 that you can make happen.
It's great. Yeah, of course, the pitfall of that is that then the article comes out, a year before the book does, which is not something one's publisher generally likes to see happen. But because of the article, it really, enabled me to go to a whole new level, with the research and the travel for the book. And so I really think it was kind of a win-win.
Yeah, and hopefully garnered some interest, in your work, and then later in the book itself.
Yeah, exactly. And even that National Geographic article, it still gets a lot of airplay. I still see it, so people are still reading it and sharing it. And, so I think it still has relevance even like once my book came out, which
Yeah.
is, of course, yeah.
And so, yeah, let's start kind of at the beginning. And you mentioned going to Japan and writing this article. So you traveled to Japan to learn about forest therapy, and something which I had no idea was a thing. So this was very interesting to me. So what did you find? What are the Japanese doing?
Yeah, so the Japanese are among the most stressed out people on the planet, right? So they work incredibly long office hours, very long work hours. It's a very stressed out population, high rates of depression and suicide. And so the government has been, really advocating ways in which to help people kind of de-stress. One of those ways is through this kind of forest bathing thing, which is not, I mean, some people I think now think of it as being the sort of ancient Japanese tradition, and it's really not. It's just something that started to be popularized in the 1980s by some environmental psychology researchers. And what they find is that even after 15 minutes of walking in the woods, and I'll just define forest bathing briefly, it's basically this practice by which you open up all of your senses and you're actively engaging all of your senses. So you're really paying attention to what it is that you smell or hear or what the moss feels like under your feet. And then there's a tactile piece and a taste piece as well, where you may be like drinking some bark tea or some tree from chrysanthemums or something found in the forest. And you're actually like touching some of the bark on the trees, or maybe like lying on top of a boulder. Sometimes you're with a guide who can help facilitate, some of these exercises that really just create this kind of mindfulness, right? In which your senses are open. And the cool thing is the science being done shows that after just 15 minutes of this, your blood pressure drops, your heart rate drops, your heart rate variability shifts in a way that makes it more responsive to stress and sort of more versatile and agile, which is something that you really want. And people's moods and well-being really increase at the same time. Oh, and their cortisol levels drop. And cortisol levels are, can be a measure of stress. So
lots of good things happen.
Lots of good things happen in just 15 minutes. And sure enough, I spent some time with these executives going out there with the Rangers, and they you just watch their sort of shoulders drop, and they would sigh and say, "Oh my God, I feel so good out here. I feel so much better."
Yeah. So you, I want to switch to talking about David Strayer, because I found him to be very interesting, and he sort of is sprinkled throughout the book in different ways. And it seems like his research took a bit of a different approach to what the Japanese were doing. Maybe talk a little bit about who he is and why he was so important in so many different parts of your book.
Yeah, he's a really amazing guy. And I feel like in some ways his work really kind of emblematizes the American approach to this research. In Asia and countries I went to in Western Europe, where there's a lot of emphasis on kind of preventative healthcare, a lot of the research in this area is really focused on emotional health and sort of preventing depression, for example. Whereas in the United States, people are really interested in productivity and creativity, right? It's like, how do you hack your life so that you can be more, better? And it has to do with like being a better worker and being a better employee and being more productive and being more creative. And so Strayer he's a cognitive neuroscientist. He's really interested in creativity. He's interested in the attentional networks in our brains and how we tend to dial that up or dial that down in ways that can make us sharper, mentally. And he also he works at the University of Utah. He's a professor there, and so he himself is a very avid outdoorsman. So he goes on rafting trips and he goes on backpacking trips, and he just noticed personally that he got some of his best ideas and sort of most brilliant insights, after he was out backpacking for 3 days. And so as the scientist in him was like, I wonder what's really going on there with our brains, and can we capture it? Can we see it? Is there a way to image that and, try to find out what's really going on? And so as a result, he has now conducted a number of experiments in which he does things like, he'll give people sort of paper tasks of creativity, and he's noticed a 50% increase in creativity before and after, for example, a 3-day backpacking trip, and that was done in Outward Bound students. But now he's actually imaging people's brains using portable EEG machines, which basically measure your brain waves and sort of your electrical activity in different parts of your brain. And what he's specifically looking at is our frontal cortex, which is kind of our most newly evolved thinking and task-oriented parts of our brains. That part of our brain is kind of overworked, I would say, in daily life. All the time we're constantly, checking things off our to-do list, and we're solving problems all day long at our desks. And it's our frontal cortex is really managing all that. And it gets fatigued, when you do that. And then we get fatigued and we get sort of grumpy. But a really amazing thing happens when you go out for a hike, and especially over several days. And it's that your thinking brain really dials down. And what comes online instead is your more sensory brain. By the third day, you end up hearing things that you didn't hear on day one. You see things you didn't see on day one. You smell things, smell different. Your senses really sharpen. And it turns out that our nervous systems love that. That's how we evolved, right? For, hundreds of thousands of years. And so our brain becomes in this kind of comfortable space that's more sensory oriented. And so then what happens is, if you think of our attentional network, our frontal cortex kind of as a muscle, if we're giving it a little bit of a break, when we go back to work 3 days later, it's sharper. It's like it's had a break and it's ready to go back online. It's a little vacation. And there's even some really interesting research showing that we can take micro breaks that may facilitate that as well. So, for example, in kids with ADHD, if they run around for 20 minutes in a green space, and then they perform some tasks, their attention too is much sharper just after 20 minutes. If we sit at an office and we have a tree outside of our window, even that can help facilitate a really micro break, a couple of seconds, where we're giving our thinking brains a small break. And then we perform better on sort of certain cognitive tests even after that. So it's really interesting just how green space seems to offer like a little bit of stress mediation and also a little bit of cognitive restoration.
Yeah, and you sort of mentioned those micro break ideas, and we mentioned this whole 15 minutes idea. And I thought one of the more interesting points that you raise within the book is that time in nature has a dose curve. You talk about that concept, and that you structured the book kind of around that idea. So maybe talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I really had to struggle with how to structure the book because, there are these different kind of outcomes, right? You can look at emotional outcomes, or you can look at cognitive outcomes, or you can look at things like the immune system. Across different environments. But ultimately, what I thought would be the most useful, really, for people was to organize the book by dose. And so what happens in the first 5 minutes, of being in nature, or what can we get from the nearby nature, the trees on our street, the pocket park in our block. And I think that has a lot of relevance for sort of our everyday urban lives. And then what happened, we could almost think of our allocation of nature as kind of like a food pyramid, right, where the bottom is this kind of our bread and butter really is this everyday nature, right, that we're surrounded by, that we live with. But the middle of the pyramid is kind of these more intentional or immersive experiences in nature, where we might go to a state park or a local park or have a picnic in a park. We're there for 45 minutes or a couple of hours, and then at the time there are different levels of benefits there. Kind of the more time you spend in nature, the more benefits you get. It's sort of the rough curve that we have found. And then at the very tippy top, and in the last part of the book, I really talk a lot about wilderness exposure and what happens during this kind of 3 days outside, where you have really much more kind of profound, I think, shifts in your self-concept, more ability to really heal and start to recover from traumatic life experiences. It's a space where you can grieve, not breathe, where you can grieve and, think about who you are, right, and who you want to be. And if you look at different cultures, right, across history and across time, so many traditions have kind of almost universally ritualized this kind of deep time in nature to memorialize life transitions, for example, rites of passage, And it's something that our culture has just completely lost. And so I'm really interested too in what happens when we've lost that.
Hmm. Yeah, and thinking about the different sensory information, I guess, that we can get hit with. I mean, one of the things you talked about was when you went to Korea and you got to experience the cypress trees and how that felt. So maybe talk a little bit about what it was like kind of wandering through that forest and what senses that was at least working for you.
Yeah, so I talk a lot about the senses in the book, and I have a sort of a chapter on every sense. And I was really, really interested in our olfactory sense and how that's kind of, triggered and affected by being in different nature environments. In South Korea, there's almost this kind of fetishization of the forest smells, specifically with this cypress tree called a hinoki cypress tree. And it's almost like Christmas. I describe it in the book as sort of Christmas tree meets vapor rub. That it's
Yeah.
this incredibly invigorating, revitalizing, sort of delicious scent. It's given off by chemicals in these trees, these sort of tree aromatics. And researchers have found in Japan that when our immune cells are exposed to those molecules, those scent molecules, we actually produce more killer T cells. Like our killer T cells reproduce, and those are immune cells that are really important for fighting cancer, for example. And after some time in these woods with these scents, and they've controlled for this by putting people in hotel rooms and just kind of vaporizing, misting these hinoki cypress oils into a hotel room and comparing that to people who are in a hotel room that is not misting these wonderful smells. And they found that, yes, their killer T cells increase, as well as their feelings of well-being and feelings of vitality. So now there's this kind of worship of these trees and these smells. There are forests that have these they're they're called them healing forests. In Japan, there are forest therapy trails. There's this very clear intention to kind of medicalize these benefits of being in nature. And you can in fact buy all kinds of products now that are scented with the hinoki cypress. Everything from, believe it or not, and I'm not kidding, panty liners to toothpaste, to shampoos and soaps and these kinds of essential oils that you can put in misters.
Wow.
So,
Everything.
yeah, everything. And it's being researched, which is neat.
Right. That's a great, I guess, combination between the two worlds. I like that.
Yeah.
So smell is very powerful and works. And you talked about sound, which I also found fascinating. I also love this new word, anthrophone. So
Mhm.
maybe talk about the anthrophone and how sound affects our well-being, and things like bird song really can have an effect on us.
Yeah, well, I was so interested in how affected I was by noise pollution. So I moved to DC and I immediately was so annoyed by how loud it was. Like I live under the flight path of Reagan National Airport. So I have these low flying jets overhead. There's a ton of traffic noise. There's construction noise. There are leaf blowers. There are lawnmowers. I was so annoyed by these sounds that I was very interested not only in researching, the benefits of natural sounds, but how crummy it is for us, when we're surrounded by these really obnoxious kind of motor sounds.
Hmm.
And it turns out that especially in Europe, there have been a lot of studies looking at the damage of noise pollution. And even when we're asleep, our sympathetic nervous system kicks into gear when there's a plane overhead or a loud truck rumbling by. And we start to put out a little bit of, an epinephrine response, a little bit of a stress response. And over time, those small stress responses really accumulate to the point where people who live near large airports in Europe have been shown to require greater anxiety medication. They have greater incidence of stroke and cardiovascular disease that are stress related. So even if you think, sort of consciously that the airplane noise doesn't bother you or you're used to it, your body is still putting out this kind of micro stress response when you hear it. But the good news is that if we can find a quiet place where there are nature sounds, the opposite happens. Our parasympathetic nervous system kicks into gear, and that's the side of our nervous system that is associated with kind of calm, digestion, relaxation. It's how we kind of sort of regulate some stress. And when we hear bird song, especially, that can not only increase our moods, but it can increase our alertness. And this has been shown in studies where, for example, birdsong gets piped into schools, after lunch. And it's the classrooms that have the birdsong, that are more alert. They'll do better on tests. The kids will feel better than the classrooms that are just listening to the normal noises of city life.
That's great. I mean, maybe that's something that offices can take into account after that sort of after lunch slump that everyone feels. Maybe it can help you.
Some already are. I mean, Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, I guess, is piping in birdsong. And there are petrol stations in the UK that are piping birdsong into the bathrooms. There are apps you can get on your phone that just, play sort of background, springtime melodies from songbirds. And I have sometimes put those on, while I'm trying to write, and it's pretty interesting. I don't do it very often. Actually, right now in Washington in the spring, we have incredible birdsong. It's just sometimes hard to hear it because of all as you mentioned, the anthrophone, which is all the sort of human-made sound that tends to overwhelm everything else.
Yeah, I actually gave that a try when I was reading the book. I found like a nature walk video on YouTube and put it on so that it was just a guy walking through the forest with a camera. And so I just saw the forest and heard the sounds, which included some birds, and that was it. And I just kind of had that up on my screen while I was reading the book. And I was just trying to see if, what that was like, because that was, you spoke about that so often, and it felt nice. But again, it's interesting to read about the science, because, I can feel nice, or I can not feel nice, but like you said, sometimes how we think about things isn't always connected with what our bodies are doing. Like you mentioned about we can shrug off airplane sounds, but actually they do have an effect on us.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point, which is that the science, it's hard to tease out. I mean, this isn't easy science to do. I don't think anyone can really say for sure right now that this, birdsong proves one thing or another, but it may sort of suggest it, because there are so many variables, in any given environment. Is it that nature really makes us feel good, or is it that being out of the city and out of our sort of everyday stressful lives makes us feel good? And these are hard questions that scientists like David Strayer are really trying to tease apart. And it's also often very hard to sort of conduct, large randomized case control studies where you can really prove one thing or another. But I think there are more studies coming online that are trying to do that.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and that's something that I was trying to think through. Is you have so much research in the book. How are you figuring out if a particular study was done rigorously or not? I mean, do you have a sense of looking at something and saying, okay, this I like, this is appropriate for the book, versus, oh, this looks like maybe it wasn't done properly, maybe the control group wasn't managed right? I mean, how did you work through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think good science journalists, have kind of standard ways of analyzing the rigor of a study. I mean, one thing you do is you look at the study size. And if there's a study with 12 people in it, that may be interesting, but boy, that's really not enough. That doesn't have a lot of statistical power, right? But if that study's been repeated, by 20 different labs, then it becomes perhaps more revealing. Was there a control group, or were just all these people assigned to go for a hike and then they felt good? Well, what about the people who were assigned to go walk in the city? How did they feel? Or was there a group assigned to walk in the city? Was there an exercise effect? Were people just feeling good because they were exercising? And we know that walking and getting more oxygen, all that has been very kind of clearly linked to feelings of well-being. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of things you look at, and certainly a lot of the science in this area is kind of fuzzy. But it's getting better all the time, and there's more of it all the time. There are also, one thing I was interested in is sort of different levels of evidence. So there's evidence looking at, what's going on in a Petri dish, for example, with your immune cells, what's going on with an individual. And that's where you can kind of bring in how people actually feel individually, how, what is their medical history? Did they feel differently, or was their health different after they moved, say, from a neighborhood of low green space to a neighborhood of high green space? And there have been some very, very large studies looking at actually where people live and comparing that to their medical records. For example, there was a study of 400,000 people in Holland, kind of looking at 15 different stress-related health outcomes and how close they live to green space. So that's an interesting study because it's so large. So you go from cellular to individual to these large epidemiological population studies, and on all three levels, you see effects. And so I think the evidence becomes kind of more powerful when that happens.
So you started talking about this idea of a power trail, and you wrote that 15 to 20% of people didn't like them. It didn't like they didn't really report any. They didn't seem engaged by them for whatever reason. And so that got me thinking, well, is the nature effect, is it not going to work for everybody? It's like in some ways, it seems like you said exercise is just for everybody. We say it's a good thing now. But is there a sense that maybe for some people, nature just really isn't going to work for them? And so we can't draw. I mean, so if that's the case, why? Why would we have those differences as a species, I guess?
I mean, several of the scientists I talked to really said that there seems to be about 10% of people, 10 to 15% of people for whom nature just won't work. Because when these people get out into nature, they're so anxious, like they're so stressed out, like they're so uncomfortable there because they hate the bugs. They, they can't control the weather. They're nervous about that. So yes, it looks like there's some people who just aren't comfortable in nature, and for whom the sort of restorative, restful effects, they just may not work. And there are a couple things to say about that. One is that I think that's a sign of how disconnected so many of us have become from nature. So that many of us are not growing up spending time outside in nature. We are not connecting with it from an early age, and so we just are not comfortable there. And so I think that's a really sad state of affairs. But I also think if you talk to those people who will tell you, "Oh, I hate nature," right? People like Woody Allen, who say, "Oh, I love nature. I just don't want any of it on me."
Yeah.
Right? I think we all sort of know the type. But if you say to those people, "Oh, well, you don't like nature. What do you like?" And they say, "Oh, well, I love going to the beach." Or I love playing golf, or I really like planting flowers. They don't think that that's nature. Like going to the beach is not nature, or they don't think of it that way. But of course it is, right? And so, or if they take a nice vacation, they want the view of the coastline. That's still a way to connect with nature. It's just that the way we define it, I think, kind of limits how we answer the question. And I came to have a much more generous kind of understanding of nature. Oscar Wilde has this great definition that, nature is a place where birds fly around uncooked. And I like how that just really encompasses, pretty much everywhere, everywhere we live. And it's a nice way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point that people might not think about particular parts of their lives as being exposing themselves to nature, but they are. And because of this sort of micro dosing effect that you were talking about, that can still have a positive effect on them. Going to the beach, playing golf, looking at views of the ocean. These are things that we're starting to learn actually do make a difference still. So you still are getting some of those benefits, even if you're not doing the full-on sort of 3-day nature immersion.
Yeah, I mean, those people are probably never going to be comfortable with a backpack on in a trail in the middle of a hailstorm, right? But they might really enjoy having a big window in their house, that looks out onto an oak tree.
Yeah.
And maybe that can be really helpful for them.
Right. So I want to take us again across the world to people that seemingly are addicted to nature, which is the Finnish people you write about, and it really seems like just they are out there constantly all the time engaging in outdoor activities. That's a huge part of who they are. So I guess maybe talk a little bit about the Finnish people and their connection to nature and what we can take away from that.
Well, the Finnish people are so interesting. I mean, like all of us, they have become less connected to nature, right, over the years, but they are more connected than most of us. And that is because Finland was kind of the last Western European nation to industrialize. So people still have grandparents who have farms, who live on the land. Their parents may still have a farm. A lot of people in Finland, a lot of families in Finland have these very sort of modest country cabins that they use, and that's definitely still a part of their tradition. They go to those cabins a lot, and they go berry picking and mushroom hunting and butterfly scooping and swimming on their coastlines in the summer. They love being outside, even though, often the weather in Finland is terrible. It's really cold and dark. But they have these like lighted cross-country ski trails. People still go outside in the winter in the dark, which I think is pretty diehard there in Finland. And so I think we have a lot to learn from the Finnish. I mean, they really use their landscape. I describe it. I spent some time with some Finnish people, and I just felt like it was sort of like kindergarten for grown-ups. They picnic outside, they hold hands and they sing songs, and and they make art, out of leaves. It's just, they are very kind of sensorily attuned. And in fact, you see things like, you see forest kindergartens in a lot of Scandinavia. I think 1 in 10 kids actually attends a forest kindergarten, which is basically like an outdoor preschool. With kids are outside all the time, even in terrible weather. So they have this saying there that, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. And even in the public schools there, all the kids have these galoshes, these rubber boots lined up by the door. And I was amazed to learn that 5th graders in Finland have 15 minutes of recess for every 45 minutes of instruction. So they have like 5 recesses a day. They come back from those recesses and they're able to sit still and they're able to focus on the schoolwork. And that may be the secret reason why the Finnish have such high test scores. Like you hear it's all because, it's because the teachers were so well paid or whatever. But actually, if you talk to the teachers about it, they're like, no, actually, it's because they get to run around outside. And so when they come back, they're sitting still. It's cool.
Oh, it's interesting. It sounds like a version of the Pomodoro technique. Do you know that, where you set like a timer and you work and then you have a sort of stopping time and you can just do whatever you want?
That's right. It's like nature Pomodori.
Yeah,
I love that. And that's another lesson I think that we can all take away, which is that sometimes we think, we don't have time to go for that 15-minute break, outside, or we don't have time to go for a 30-minute walk on a tree-lined street. But actually, if we do that, it does actually make us more focused and happier for the rest of the people in our lives. We become more pleasant people and more productive people if we do allow ourselves to take that break outside.
Yeah, and one of the things you talk about is walking, and I am a huge walker and I love walking, so I was very excited to read all about it. So yeah, talk a little bit about walking as a bit beyond just exercise, and you talked about a lot of studies where they compared looking at walking in nature versus walking in cities. What's happening there when we're outside, when we're just kind of walking and or rambling?
Yeah, there's something really interesting about walking that seems to trigger a certain kind of mental mind frame, a certain kind of cognitive state. Certainly, I mean, even Aristotle, right? He used to philosophize while walking the parapets. Wordsworth, wrote poetry. He composed poetry. He probably walked 10,000 miles in his lifetime. He often walked with his sister Dorothy, and they would edit and compose like while they were walking. Nikola Tesla came up with his very revolutionary engine while he was walking in a city park. And James Watt invented the steam engine while walking in a city park in Glasgow. So, Thoreau, it goes on and on, right? I mean, so many philosophers talk about how their thinking is very connected to their feet and the movement of their feet. So you see this repeated sort of over and over again throughout history. But certainly we're still kind of living in the age of romantic poets. We're still living in the legacy of Romanticism, and yet, so many kids today don't go outside and they don't walk. Like, but they go from their kind of car seats, into their couches, or they go from their strollers into their car seats. I went on a hike with a Girl Scout troop in Washington, D.C., and this was, I think, mostly fifth and sixth graders at the time. And some of these girls, like, you would see they looked so unsteady on their feet, walking over some uneven surfaces. They kind of looked like they were about to fall over. And it's because they had really never walked on uneven surfaces before. If you talk to pediatricians about this, they'll tell you, the gross motor skills of kids today is very compromised compared to the gross motor skills of kids, a generation ago, who were climbing trees and, spent a lot more time having recess. Where I live in Washington, D.C., only 10% of kids are even meeting recommended recess requirements. And so you wonder what this kind of physical development has to do with your neurological development, because a lot of the research suggests that the two are very related. And it's something that I just don't think we're thinking about very much.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about how we're maybe de-evolving in that manner. I mean, what was it like for you when you were growing up in school?
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, I actually grew up in a big city. I grew up in New York City. I grew up on the Upper West Side, but I grew up in between two parks. I grew up between Riverside Park and Central Park. And, this was in the 70s and 80s, where kids were really like allowed to run around by themselves or with their friends. And my friends and I used to go to the parks all the time, and we used to run around, and we had a very long recess, and we used to play kickball after school every day. These were the days when going inside meant you were bored, right? It was like the same old stupid after school shows on TV, and who wanted to be there doing that? And so we loved being outside. Whereas now, there's so many temptations to keep us inside. Like, being inside is actually sort of where we want to be, because it's now where the technology bells are sort of, yanking our dopamine buttons. So unfortunately, there's not that much driving us outside in the way that there used to be when we were kids.
Yeah, and I thought there was one chapter where you talked about this group, Higher Ground, and I think that was interesting in terms of, a group working to get people outside in a therapeutic sense to try and help them. And, it was really heartbreaking to read about their stories. Maybe talk about Higher Ground and how people are slowly starting to come around to the idea that nature is something that can be evidence-based and science-based, and maybe the Veterans Administration and psychologists should actually start pursuing that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a chapter towards the last part of the book where I'm looking at wilderness. And I spent about 5 or 6 days on a wilderness river trip in Idaho with a group of women veterans, all of whom had PTSD. And in this case, in PTSD, you are sort of hyper vigilant. If you hear a book drop, it sounds like gunfire. From combat war veterans, they've been through a lot of trauma. They've, just been through a lot of just really being scared, which changes your brain. And so the response to that is to want to kind of withdraw, really, from sensory input. And so a lot of veterans who have PTSD have a really hard time being in public spaces. They have a hard time even leaving their homes sometimes. It just becomes too much to handle. And yet, when you're out in the wilderness, sort of the opposite happens. In some ways, the wilderness is kind of this interesting antidote to PTSD, because your senses eventually, slowly start to open. You want to see the sun hit the rocks in a certain way, that alpenglow and the sunset. You want to see the eagle soaring overhead. There's a rapid coming up in the river, and you have to pay attention to it. The world is sort of incredibly, astoundingly beautiful and filled with awe and beauty. And it turns out that experiencing awe, and there's a whole science of awe, and I talk about this in the book, it tends to really draw us out of our personal problems. It makes us feel more connected to each other and more connected to the natural world around us. Those are very, very healing feelings. And they also can make us feel more resilient when we do face stress. Being open to beauty has been shown to be very powerful for healing. And what better place, than the wilderness? I mean, yes, you can experience this in a symphony or, in a museum, but it's a really sustained exposure, when you're in a wilderness area for 6 days. And, so I was really able to watch these women kind of transform out there, where they really came out of their shells. They told me they were sleeping better than they had slept in years. They were eating better. Food tasted better. They were engaging in more sort of social interaction and really enjoying laughing and singing together. They stayed in touch after the trip. So the trip really facilitates these social bonds that we also know are incredibly important for psychological well-being. So now the VA is really studying the benefits of wilderness and adventure therapy on this population. There's so many other interventions that don't seem to be working so well. There's a lot of medication. There's a lot of cognitive therapy. Some of those things can work, especially if you adhere to them, but a lot of veterans don't adhere to sort of the full program. Whereas when you're out in the wilderness, it could be a good sort of collaborative or sort of reinforcing kind of like adjuvant therapy, because you then can reinforce the therapy that you're doing when you get back home.
So that kind of wraps it up for my questions. Did you have any other lessons or anything else big that you wanted people to take away from the book as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that I think we all tend to undervalue how good it feels to be outside. When we are outside, we're sometimes still listening to our phones, or we're still ruminating about our task list or our to-do list. We're not like fully mindful or present in that space. And so, one of the tips I have is just next time you go outside, really just pay attention. Pay attention to the environment itself. Listen to the bird song, see what the trees smell like, look at some fractal patterns, in a creek, and pay attention to those elements, but then also notice how they make you feel. And it may be that, you might be a person who loves the ocean, but doesn't like the forest. Or you may be a person who, likes the forest, but feels completely freaked out by the ocean. And so pay attention to what kinds of environments really make you feel great. And then, go out into them. So go outside often. That's my final.
I like it. All right, let's do 3 quick rapid fire thunder round questions to get to know you, and then we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Okay.
All right, what is your favorite food and or drink?
My favorite food, well, I'm really into coconut water right now. I'm drinking a lot of coconut water. In fact, here it is. I'm drinking some right now. It replaces electrolytes. It tastes delicious. It's really good. Food. I totally love seafood. Give me any kind of seafood. Calamari, salmon, wild salmon. There you go. Wild salmon. That's my
Okay, I love salmon, so agreed. Where is your favorite place you've ever been? And you've been to a lot of beautiful places, so I'm curious to know.
Well, I think my heart really belongs in the American West. So there you go. Even though I grew up in New York City, I spent summers in the West. I was really lucky to do that, especially on a river. My happy place is a wild, free-flowing river in the West.
All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
If I could change any one thing, it would be to get children outside, because they love it when they're there. And we, as their parents and their teachers and their society, are putting up all these roadblocks to letting them just be kids. So I want to get more kids outside. I'm passionate about that.
All right, well, thank you very much. The book is The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. It's outstanding and has much more of an in-depth look at everything we've been talking about. I really highly recommend it. It's inspired me to get out more, and I think it'll do the same for you. Florence, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, John. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.